everybody, and welcome to today's Attachment Theory in Action episode. I am super excited to welcome our guest today, Dr. Lisa Firestone. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Attachment Theory in Action. I am super excited to be your host for today, and I'm even more excited to welcome our guest, Dr. Lisa Firestone. Lisa is a clinical psychologist and the Director of Research and Education at the Glendon Association and Senior Editor at psychalive.org. She is the author of numerous articles and book chapters and co-authored with her father, Robert Firestone, the books Self Under Siege, Conquer Your Critical Inner Voice, and Creating a Life of Meaning and Compassion. Dr. Firestone is a national and international trainer and presenter on topics including suicide and violence prevention, assessment, and treatment. She has been involved in clinical training and research in the areas of suicide and violence, which resulted in the development of the Firestone Assessment of Self-Destructive Thoughts and the Firestone Assessment of Violent Thoughts for adults and adolescents. Lisa is a clinical psychologist in private practice and consultant on the management of high-risk clients. You can learn more about Lisa's work at www.drlisafirestone.com. I'm so glad to have this conversation with Lisa, and hope you enjoy today's episode. Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Attachment Theory in Action. And I am so excited to welcome Dr. Lisa Firestone. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been fun. It's fun to talk about this stuff.
Absolutely. I have done, a bit of research on everything that you have done, and I'm super excited to learn more about your work and how the things that you've studied and researched and experienced, particularly on the self, show up in our world of attachment, and how some of our early experiences can really play a part in impacting the self, and then how that shows up in our adult relationships and the work that we do. But first of all, what I'd really love to hear about is how did you get into this work? How did you end up focusing your attention really on the self and a person's inner voice? So where did it begin, and how did you get where you are?
Okay, well, I grew up in a very psychological family. My dad's a psychologist, and it's an intergenerational condition in our family. My adult son is now a psychologist, so it just happens, as are a couple of my sisters. So, so I got sort of immersed in thinking about people and how they operate and what drives us and how we develop our sense of self from all of that. My father is a theorist as well, has written many books, who writes about the development of the self. In fact, we have a book together called Self Under Siege. We have a few books that we've written, but he's written even more. So he got interested in the idea of how people are turned against themselves, why they don't act in their own self-interest. So he got really interested in this idea that people are divided. There's a part of us that wants to live, that's goal-directed, that's life-affirming, that's the side we like to hope to be on most of the time. But we also have a part that's self-critical, self-hating, and its ultimate end can be destructive to ourselves or others. So in the development of that, how does that happen? And what he really believes is that, parents have children with the best of intentions, right? But that they're divided themselves. And because they have mixed feelings about themselves, they extend both of those reactions to their products, to their children. So the most important thing if you're a parent is to really feel good about yourself and be more sided with your real self than this anti-self, if you will. But the degree to which you're not, or the degree to which you get triggered into that other state, you're going to react to your children that way too. And you're going to see them through both those lenses. And the positive side of that leads to parental nurturance and, good care and, ability to set limits with your children, but that are appropriate and, all kinds of things, because kids need both, support, but they also need guidance, right? But the anti-self side of that leads to, hostility towards kids in moments of stress, especially if we have a more unresolved trauma and loss, and that's comes from the attachment research. It leads to, just making negative comments about yourself in front of your children, or showing this way you feel about yourself in front of your children by your behavior, which kids internalize. When you call yourself a stupid idiot when you make a mistake, your child doesn't think, oh, my parent's a stupid idiot. They think, I'm a stupid idiot. I come from stupid idiots. This is who I am. And that's, even though you may not be directing it at them. Worse yet, in the moments of frustration when you actually are yelling those kinds of things at them. Not ideal. And, partly because as children, we're so completely dependent on those adults, whoever the attachment figures are available in our environment. We internalize those things quite deeply. And so and as humans, we're just trying to survive like all creatures. So we pay a lot more attention to the negative than the positive, because the positive doesn't scare us or upset us. But at moments of stress, that's when we very much internalize those things. So unfortunately, you could have a very nice 3-week vacation with your children, and you remember all the fun places you went, and you hope they do too. But they remember more strongly the one time you yelled at them at the end of the day when it was frustrating and you were tired and everybody was hungry and, they were not acting particularly well and neither were you, and that's what they internalize the most. And that's really unfortunate, but it's true. And, I think it's just important to be aware of that. And again, it's not that I think parents should be perfect and have no bad behavior, but the ability to repair when we have had a rupture. Just like there's no perfect therapist either, right? We're going to have ruptures, but if we can repair, we build resilience. So if it doesn't work out, it gets repaired. A child can still internalize the good. If it doesn't get repaired, if small traumas as well as big traumas don't get resolved, a lot of negative messages are internalized. And they play out in terms of this being turned against ourselves, thinking badly about ourselves, perhaps thinking suspiciously and badly about others as well, as a way of feeling self-protective, but that it, as an adult, is not really adaptive. Because all of these things are adaptive to the environment we're born into. Kids make the best adaptation they can with what they have available. But those adaptations, or attachment patterns, as we might call them, that they develop about ideas about how relationships go, lead them to certain beliefs and things they tell themselves that then are probably not adaptive to their adult life in a new situation.
One of the things that you mentioned that for me really stands out as a distinction that I think many adults don't realize is that you said, if I say that I'm a stupid idiot in front of my child, the child doesn't think that about you as the adult, they think it about themselves. And I think that that's a huge piece that many parents or people in caregiving roles, or even, a teacher or a therapist may say and doesn't realize the impact and how that becomes internalized by the child.
Right. And I think that's true. I think people are really unaware of it. They think, oh, it's okay to run myself down. I mean, obviously, I shouldn't probably run my child down, but it isn't. And, you see how body issues get transferred from generation to generation. I think about a young woman I know who knew she had these body issues, but she wasn't as sure about where they came from until they took her 90-year-old grandmother to the swimming pool with them. And she was very embarrassed to get in a bathing suit at age 90. She was worried about her body image. And you're like, she's lucky to be alive at age 90. It really doesn't matter. She's this frail little old woman, but she's still very self-conscious. And you can see her mother's internalized that, daughters internalize that. And it just gets passed from one generation to the next, whether or not, you direct it outwardly toward the child.
And I think that's an important thing to note, especially for some of our listeners who are parents and caregivers, that it's a lot of the time it's not an intentional behavior. Again, you're not intentionally trying to emotionally harm your child or give them negative thoughts or perceptions about themselves. It's often very unconscious and unintentional. One of the questions that I had put down to kind of pose to you, but as you're talking, I'm kind of thinking about it. The question was, how does attachment style impact a person's inner voice? And I'm almost thinking that it's not really attachment style to begin with. It's our parents, our caregivers, those caregiving people in those roles who their attachment style impacts the child's attachment style that then impacts that inner voice. And it's kind of like this circle going on.
Right, right. And what we know from attachment research is that an adult attachment interview with an adult will predict what kind of attachment they're going to have with their child even before the child is born. So it makes a lot of sense that, the parents' adaptations that they had to make to their early caregivers affect our ability to parent, to teach, to mentor, to be therapists, right? It affects us in all those roles where we're trying to impact people and help guide them. Of course, our most vulnerable young children, our children are going to have the brunt of that, but it affects us everywhere. And so whatever adaptation we make gets then internalized by the child because our behaviors represent our adaptation. So, if we had an adaptation of avoidant attachments where we turn down the volume on our needs and try not to have them, a child crying is a big threat because it stirs up all those feelings that we're working very hard. It's not that easy to keep all that stuff down. And so we may see the child as very needy or as, crying just to bother us. Or, I've heard parents say these things and they, we can say, okay, that doesn't make sense. A 6-month-old baby doesn't cry to manipulate you. But that feeling can come through and come across to the baby. And what the baby learns is I better pull all this in and shove it below my awareness because otherwise I feel shame. And part of the reason why, they internalize the things that the parents' shortcomings as their own is because we want to feel safe. Our number one thing is we want to feel safe as children. So we see our parents as okay, and the problem's got to be here. That gives us a false sense of control, by the way, because if I only act different, then they'll love me. Or if I only act different, then they will. And we do adapt in ways that can get our needs met when we have a parent that is at least predictable. When we have a caregiver that's unpredictable, as a disorganized type of attachment, and is alarming and threatening at times, then we have a more fragmented sense of self because we have, so much terror going on that we've got a lot of unresolved trauma. So, and often that parent who's causing that has a lot of unresolved trauma that's getting triggered by these little mini me's, our children, or the students that we're working with, or the patients we're working with, and that stir up those feelings that we don't want to feel.
I wanted to touch briefly on your use of the word adaptive because I know in the attachment world, the use of adaptive attachment has, been prevalent for years now, which is wonderful. But for many of our folks that we work with that don't have a deep understanding of attachment and attachment theory, I know something that I've personally been trying to do is really explain to people about the use of the word adaptive. And I really loved what you said just a little bit ago about they're adapting to the demands of the environment around them. And so I also love to share with people this idea that they've survived, it's a way to help them feel empowered that their brains, their bodies adapted to respond to what was available to them at the time. And they develop these really survival skills. If I can survive by shutting my feelings down or turning my crying off, that's a survival skill. And talking to some adult clients or patients about that has been really empowering to them to know that I survived, but it's only now in my healthy relationships that those survival skills look kind of odd and they're unhelpful and unhealthy.
Right, because I shut down with my partner and I don't express my wants or needs because I don't want to feel the shame of them maybe not responding. But we can handle that as an adult. That's the difference between being an adult and an infant. We can handle that. So if our partner doesn't respond exactly how we might want them to, we still survive. But as infants, we didn't feel that. Because literally if the people in our environment walk away, we can't do anything for ourselves. Very different than when we're an adult, where we can have lots of choices and lots of power. But those adaptations were the best we could do with what we were given. And, we did survive. And I think that's really important for people to realize. They didn't develop psychological defenses because they wanted to be this guarded person. They developed them because that was what was necessary to get our needs met. The way Dan Siegel explains it is that, before we're born, we're at one with another person. We don't have to work for anything. The food comes, it's a nice regulated temperature in the womb. There's not a lot to complain about. But the minute that we're born, we have to, quotes, work for a living. We have to get those people, and you can see it if you look at some of the still face experiments where babies are looking at the moms, they are reacting to micro expressions of their mothers because they're very tuned in. Like, how do I figure out these people and how do I get them to take care of me? And one of the very few mechanisms they have to get our attention is crying. Then they develop that smiling thing, and that really hooks adults in, right? They use everything they've got, but they don't have a lot of potential options for behavior. And they're trying to get their needs met. And they do whatever works for those parents. So if you just kind of keep all those wants and needs under the surface, but then they basically meet your basic needs. So they feed you, they provide shelter, it's an emotional desert perhaps, but it's not, you can survive it. You will do that. Another adaptation is where you're anxiously attached, where you've had to turn up the volume on your needs to get your needs met because your parent is intermittently available, which is it's intermittent reinforcement, which is very addictive. So it's like, sometimes they're there, but sometimes they're not. And sometimes they're giving me a hug because they need a hug. And that emotional hunger is actually draining to a child. So they don't look like they're thriving. So, we're really looking at what that looks like. So a parent who has unresolved emotional needs like that is anxiously attached, is going to be anxiously attached to their child, and they're going to do a bit of clinging, and the baby's going to do more clinging because that's what works. If I stay focused on whether I'm getting what I want, I turn up the volume, I do get what I basically need. But I don't internalize a sense of calm in either of those adaptations. And that's what we get with secure attachment. When we feel safe, which is the number one, which babies will feel safe, even in the hands of people who they're really not safe with because it's too terrifying and fragmenting to think we're not safe. And we want to feel attuned to, seen for who we are, so that the person starts to read our signals. And, if you have a mother who is not substance abusing, who is not in a depression or something like that, your brains naturally change to attune to that baby. And to learn that, if you're working with students, you learn them, you learn your patients. It's a process, right? We want to feel soothed when we're distressed. So our attachment system really gets activated when we're distressed. I often show a picture of a baby starting to cry, and that's, this is your attachment system activating. I need something here. And it's how we respond in those times, especially within the first year of life, that tend to lay down these models of how we see the world. They shape the lens through which we see the world ongoing. And they also shape the kind of responses we give and elicit from others. So if you have secure attachment to a parent, you go to school and teachers like you better, and students like you better, and everything goes, and that reinforces people are going to be there for me, and this is all going to work out. Again, not perfectly, but good enough. But if you have one of these other attachments, then you elicit certain responses that make you feel like you need to keep doing your adaptation. And we do this in our adult relationships. We pick partners who mimic, some of those issues with our parents often. And then we feel like, oh, yes, I have to do this. I have to keep checking in with this person and demanding attention because that's the only way you get attention. And I'm avoidant. I have to keep pushing this person away to keep some space for myself because that's what worked as a kid. And so.
Go ahead.
Oh, so, I'm always encouraging people to date people who are different, not your type.
We chuckle about that, but it is so. First of all, I really love the way that you explain the attachment styles, and I loved your comment about with the adaptive attachment styles that even though there is maybe a sense of control for the individual, there is still not a sense of calm. And I think a lot about the educators that I've worked with who, I mean, I've worked with early childhood educators as all the way up to high school educators. But I think about the kind of the mindset of, well, they're in my classroom, they're safe, I'm a good teacher. Why am I still seeing these behaviors? And not that we are putting blame anywhere, but I think it's helpful for adults in whatever role they take with a child or young person to know that it's not necessarily their fault, but there are these systems that are playing off of each other. So we've got the child system playing off of your system, and their system is acting in a certain way to get your system to respond in a certain way. And it takes us as the more controlled adult to kind of break that cycle. And so I really appreciate you sharing some of that information about, what the child is projecting, because I think that many of the folks I work with, they often express feeling helpless.
Mhm.
I don't know what else to do. And I think when you break it down into kind of these systems of the child system and your system, and where are the things that you can control and not control.
Right, right. And even if you are a very different person than the person they're interacting with at home, the issue is that they have a lot, it's hard to trust that. So they're going to do all kinds of things to test you. This is what happens when kids get adopted, right? Or put in foster care, everything. Oh, now you're in a safe place, you're going to feel relaxed. No, they're going to see, okay, what does it take here? And is it, how, and unconsciously their behaviors are going to be eliciting reactions that are just like what they got at home. So I think the issue for those of us who are a therapist or a teacher or in any kind of mentoring role, to kind of take a step back and go, okay, I need to show up as who I want to be in this situation, whatever the other person puts out, because eventually a child will be very impacted, by the way, by a teacher. There's a lot of research on resilient kids who do well even though they're in difficult situations, and one caring adult can make a big difference, and certainly teachers can be that. I think about a guy I know who had very chaotic, violent home childhood, but he had this one teacher. He came to school one day after going home for lunch and was wiping away tears because it had been a really traumatic interaction at home. And the teacher just asked him to stay after class and just said, hey, how are you doing? And he doesn't even remember what he says, but he remembers that an adult noticed and cared to this day. And he's in his 70s. I mean, those are big differences we can make by being somebody who pays attention and does learn the person and does respond in a way where they feel safe, seen, and soothed when they're distressed. And it's not that it's our job to soothe all our students. I mean, that's, but when they're distressed, and they're not always distressed, and there's those children that are young people that it's really easy to relate to, who have maybe had secure attachments at home. But, there's those where it's more challenging. And that's where we really need to challenge ourselves. And particularly when, there was no organized strategy, which for a child is fear without solution. So it does lead to fragmentation. So you may see different aspects of the child. You may see them freeze under certain circumstances. I think about when I worked at a child abuse clinic, and we had one little boy who would literally freeze if he heard a loud noise. I mean, he just couldn't move. And, that was the most adaptive thing to do at his home, by the way. But it wasn't, it looked very odd in another situation while the kids are playing or running on a playground. And so what? There's a loud noise, but it's just, you can see how these adaptations affect things, but you can, and that's where it matters if you have your own sense of inner security and calm, and whether you have the ability to kind of reflect on, what is this child stirring up for me? So if they're acting a certain way, what might that have to do with my past? There's an ancient Buddhist practice that I'm very fond of called RAIN. It's recognize what you're experiencing. So if you're having a strong emotional reaction to one of the people you're working with, think about what might that have to do with, first of all, label it. What is the feeling you're having? be able to sit with it, which is the A, allow it to be, acknowledge what it is, and accept it. It will pass. It's okay. And then the I is to kind of investigate, what might this have to do with my own past that I'm having such a strong reaction? Because very few things are life-threatening to us in our adult life today. We're not getting chased by tigers, or not, having to forage for food that we might not find. Those things are all too easy, right? So, when we feel like something's very, very upsetting, it's interesting to think about what might it have to do with. And an acronym I really like from my friend and colleague Dan Siegel is SIFT. We can sift through our mind, look for any sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts as we sit with a painful feeling or a difficult feeling, and just see what comes up. And then the N of RAIN is to not over-identify with it. Whatever, we can be angry without being an angry person. We can have had an abusive experience as a child, but that may have shaped who we are, but it doesn't define who we are, So we don't have to over-identify with thoughts and feelings just because we're having them. People say, well, I'm feeling this, so it means that. No, not necessarily. Let's look at that and see what it might have to do with your past. And that's always a really interesting exercise to do. And it could be helpful because any unresolved traumas that you have, and they don't have to be big T trauma like we think of as abuse or situational as life-threatening, but I think of trauma more as anything that changed how you saw yourself, other people, and the world. And there's lots of things like that, getting lost in the store, from your parent, was probably not life-threatening, but it could feel that way to a young child. And it may have changed, how you felt about how you saw the world, and it's more dangerous or whatever, all kinds of ideas or internalized thoughts about yourself that you're unimportant or don't matter or invisible to people, whatever. You can internalize all kinds of things. And so it's important to look at those unresolved issues. And when kids or people we're working with really stir us up, it's interesting to look at, what is this about? Why is this so emotional?
First of all, I really like the RAIN acronym: recognize, acknowledge, investigate, and then not over-identify. I really, really like that, and I see that as being I want to say simple, but I don't mean it in that it's simple. It's maybe an accessible tool that people can use, and really just really appreciate your focus on us as the adult or the caregiver, or even just as an individual. If we're talking about adult relationships, whether that be a work relationship or an intimate relationship, taking the focus off of the other person and onto ourselves. We in many of the trainings I've done in the last 3 or 4 years, we've really tried to push for people to start thinking about, as you put it, what is this stirring up for me? What am I bringing to the relationship? What are my experiences bringing to this interaction or this relationship? And really trying to show them the power and the value of doing that, because I think so often, and I think I read this in one of your book descriptions, but so often we focus on the other person, and trying to fix them or trying to find fault with them, instead of looking at, what are our inner experiences, what is our inner voice telling us. And so I really appreciate you kind of bringing that focus back on the self.
Right. It makes us much more powerful because we have 100% control over what we do. We have 0% control over what the other person does, as much as we'd like to think we do. We don't, or we have more than that. But, and we can change our half of the dynamic and things will shift. And that's really empowering if you think about it, because if you take a step back and can change, what do you do just before the person does the thing that really bothers you? Because that's the part you have some control over, and if you, start complaining about things and your partner tries to fix them, and maybe that really annoys you, you just want to vent, it's important to think about, okay, well, maybe how could I present this in a way my partner could provide what I need? And I don't know, there's this thing, do you need to be heard? Do you need to be hugged, heard? What do you need right now? And, that's another way to approach it too. So when our partner does something that says us, what is it that they need right now? What is it that and, again, they've got adaptations that came from their childhood. We've got adaptations that came from ours. But we have a lot of power to change the dynamic. With people we're working with or with people we're relating to more closely by changing our part of it. And that's why I think it's much more empowering to focus on your part. People want the blame to be out here, but blame is really not very helpful. Whether it's blaming our partners or our parents or our children, none of it's very helpful. It's really interesting to think about, wait, what's going on here? And what could I do differently that could get a different response? Now, as infants, we don't have that choice. We don't have very many options of behavior. But as adults, we have a ton. We can be quieter. We can take a minute before we respond. We can, do a lot of different things that can help us deal with our own mental state. And then we can respond from a place that is more who we want to be. We can show up as who we want to be in the world. But, it's hard if we haven't internalized a sense of calm and if we've had a lot of unresolved trauma. And, we can look at what feeling is it that comes up, that's another exercise that we do a lot. And I borrowed from a book by Sue Johnson in Emotionally Focused Therapy. She has a book called Hold Me Tight. And she talks about the feeling that gets stirred up when you have that same argument over and over again with your partner or with your child or whatever it is. And, what's that feeling? And if you get to what that feeling is, it's usually a feeling that goes way back to your childhood. And, she has this list of words that are, I see people go through it and they kind of go, oh, kind of, maybe, there it is, and there's sort of this feeling. But if you can say that to yourself each time that comes up, oh, it's just that again, it calms the whole thing down. We now know that from research by putting people in a brain scanner and looking at if they can name their emotion, their brain calms down, But that means having some emotional literacy, right? And being able to name our emotions and slowing down long enough to pay attention to what's going on inside of us.
Right. I want to talk more about, I'd like to hear about, how do we get to that point? But something I wanted to just kind of piggyback on what you're saying is that we do a lot of work now with people about their why and why they do what they do and why do they keep turning up to work, especially when we're working with challenging situations or challenging people. And your comment about, being who you really are, being true to yourself. And I think about, so many times when I work with particularly teachers who go into the field with this love to help children, to give them a good experience, maybe to give them something that we had as an adult, but they maybe aren't experiencing. And then we challenge them with, are your actions, are you showing up as that person that you truly want to be? Are you matching your why? And, when we can help them reach the realization that sometimes they're not showing up that way, and because we all want to show up in the best way possible, but sometimes these previous traumas, these attachment experiences that we hold within ourselves stop us from doing that. And we really try to work to teach them that if we can recognize that recognition and acknowledgement of what's going on and where it's coming from, then we can really be the person that we want to be for that child or that family that we're supporting. So I really, I love that that's something that you focus on in your work. And I see that as a strengths-based approach. So often we focus on okay, you're reacting like this and this is a problem, but if we recognize it, then it becomes a strength and we can figure out how to manage it.
Right. And once we can identify it, we don't have to be just revisited by our unresolved trauma whenever it feels like it. We can have control over it. We can go, oh, okay, I know I'm sensitive about that. When I feel that feeling stirred up, I get really reactive. I don't have to react like that. I often ask people, what is it you want to happen in this situation? So if you're approaching some kind of conflict, whether, it's as a teacher with a student or therapist with a client, or in your romantic relationship, what is the outcome you want to happen? And how can you make it more likely that outcome can happen? And it's not to be manipulative, or it's more of a strength based, like, okay, I can have some effect here because how I ask the question or how I approach the subject is going to have a lot to do with how the other person's likely to respond. And if I can be more vulnerable and transparent, they're going to be more vulnerable and transparent as well, if that's appropriate in the situation. If I can recognize and have compassion for the fact that even though this person may be behaving badly, there's probably a reason. And, understanding the why behind the why of how they're acting, why they're acting this way, instead of just, oh, it's bad behavior. Well, I think almost all bad behavior happens in a flip-lid state where the higher functions of our brain are kind of offline. This is Dan Siegel's concept of the, middle prefrontal cortex being very important in terms of sort of helping us regulate our emotions and not just react out of them. But, as anybody who interacts with young people, especially children, is going to have flip-lid moments because it's going to stir up something from our past. But in recognizing those and being able to do some self-reflection and then be able to do repair is really important. And, we can get our lid back on, we can do a lot. We can have a whole range of responses, including not responding sometimes, by the way. We think of the cerebral cortex as allowing us to do a lot more things. It also allows us not to do a lot of things that we might not do out of emotion. And, we have to remember when we're working with young kids, especially all the way up, probably in males, maybe till 26, cerebral cortex is not fully formed. And so they're not always responding and able to moderate that in the same way that we might be able to. And to keep that connection go, well, where they're able to soothe some of those emotions. And they may not have had those skills. They may, their brain is just not as developed, and I think that's important to recognize too, that when we're dealing with children, why are they crying? Well, there's usually a reason in their mind that makes sense. People rarely engage in behavior that doesn't make sense to them at the time. Now, it might not make sense to us, and it may be hard to understand because it's not getting them what they want, but it's getting the response they're used to getting. And that makes them feel comfortable, even when it's negative. That's the part about these adaptations. We elicit those negative responses from others that are old and familiar, even though they feel terrible, because they feel comfortable. And when people treat us differently, even much more positively than we're used to, that's actually scary for people. And I think that's important to recognize as a teacher. See, I'm acting so differently and providing this very nice, safe environment and being this very stable person for you. Why aren't you benefiting from it? Why aren't you, adapting to that? Well, because I go home every day to an environment that's not like that. And, it's scary to trust that somebody's going to be there for you if you haven't had that experience.
I think about, my mind goes back to the still face videos and experiments of, you see how quickly that infant changes based on that change of the adult in front of them. And it's really that same situation, but reversed, in that, the child is coming with this experience of perhaps negativity, chaos, lack of control, and now you're giving them a different experience, and it's almost like, whoa, what's happening here? Like, this doesn't feel right to me. This is strange. And so their behavior, tries to cling back some kind of control. So it's, it's a similar approach. It's a similar concept, but flipped with regards to positive and negative experiences.
You're right. And you got to remember, kids are reading all those things that you're not conscious of. So there's our words, but there's also our facial expressions, our tone of voice, our timing, our intensity. All those things matter in how we're communicating. It's much simpler with our dogs, with the pet. As long as the tone is nice, they don't care about the words or the intent, for that matter. Because they're not reading our facial expressions in the same way. But babies are very quickly. So And you can see how things get off between a parent and child. I remember one still face video I saw where the mother is nuzzling the child and the child pulls her hair he's 6 months old, he just is trying to get her to stay there. He's enjoying it. But she has a flash of anger that you can
Mm.
see on the tape, just in her look. And he goes like this. And then she tries to get him back by being more aggressive and intrusive. And he gets more and more pulled in. It's like, oh, we've gotten on such a bad footing, or a child who, steals a glance at their mother, but then the mother looks away, and there's that they don't get their timing right. And it's just so painful because they're both reacting in this hypersensitive way. And yeah, the child is used to getting those responses, and they're really good at doing it by the time we see them in a school setting or in a therapy setting. And they are looking to elicit those same reactions because that's what's familiar, and they're adapted to that. And now you're asking them to let down some of those adaptations that work really well in one environment, but not another. And while that is healing, if you do it over time, it's still very, we have to realize that we're asking the people we work with to be brave and try something different.
Right.
It's not like, oh, finally a safe place I can relax. It's like, no, you're asking me to give up everything that's worked so far. And that's supposed to make me, things better. That takes a long time to trust. So, it's just interesting. I think we should have a lot of compassion that people are doing what they're doing for a reason. It is adaptive for them. And especially when we're working with kids that are still at home with parents that, again, even with the best of intentions, may have behaviors that are not ideal in moments of stress, that we have to be aware that, okay, we're having, that's who we're impacting, and that they have to go home still. And, if you're a therapist working with children, that's why I think it's so important you have to deal with their environment. Parents want you to fix their troubled kid, but you need to fix the whole system, because if you don't, you're telling a child to be different, but go back to that same system every day and night.
Right.
That's scary.
So before we wrap up, Lisa, I wanted to just maybe pose a question to you. And I know that this would be a very long answer, I'm sure. But if I'm a parent or am an adult and I realize and I think about, okay, maybe I did have some experiences that could be triggering this, maybe this unhelpful or negative inner voice, having a negative impact on myself, my inner self, and it's, perhaps impacting my relationships, whether with a partner or a child. Do you have any maybe first steps that somebody might take to start working through that or addressing that? Any kind of tips or advice as a starting point?
Sure. I think of two things. One of the things that we put in the e-course we developed was a toolkit of tools to help calm yourself down when you're distressed. First of all, learn some skills, to help calm yourself down when you're distressed, because otherwise you're going to be reacting out of those emotions in those moments. So, I think nobody can have too many skills. So I don't think that we can do anybody any harm by teaching some skills for calming down. And we have some really simple ones, like, we have one we call calming the mind, where you put one hand over your chest and one hand over your belly and take some deep breaths. And if you do this, it actually starts to calm down your mind. And, you can do that almost anywhere, right? Maybe not in front of your class, but, you can take a minute. Another that you can do anywhere, including in the grocery store, is 4-7-8 breathing, where you breathe in for a count of 4, hold it for a count of 7, and breathe out for a count of 8. If you do that 5 times in a row, and the trick is breathing out more than you breathe in, it releases serotonin in your brain, and it actually calms your brain down. And you feel more calm. It's also a great way to get to sleep at night. It does help sort of turn off all the critical inner voices or, not particularly helpful talk that may be going on in your mind, or you're stressed about, whatever else might be going on in your environment. So it's just a helpful way to kind of bring all that down. And you can do that anywhere. You can even do that in front of your class. They don't have to know.
And maybe get the class involved in it too. If you need it, it might be that they need it too.
It's always a good idea to teach kids a few skills for managing their emotions. Again, some may be getting it at home, but most of them probably aren't. And why not have some skills that everybody in the class understands? Like, so when somebody's getting upset, that they could even help another student. A student can help another student. Hey, let's do the 4-7-8 breathing that the teacher taught us, You can do 3-3-6. It doesn't matter. It's mostly the breathing out more than you breathe in.
Okay.
So you can do it whatever numbers work for you. But the idea is make it simple and make it something people can do. The other thing, if you really want to, work through these things, is you can start to do some work on yourself, and that could either be through, some kind of class that you're taking. It could be through therapy, certainly psychotherapy, and we do make this e-course on understanding, making sense of your life, walks you through the process of identifying your attachment system, first of all, based on exercises that come from a well-researched instrument called the Adult Attachment Interview. And then, looking for any unresolved traumas. So one interesting exercise we have people do is write down 10 traumas quickly that happened when you were a child. Now, there's some people who, we did this as a pilot study, who can come up with 10 with subcategories very easily, but those are people who had a fairly traumatic childhood. Mm-hmm. When you have people who didn't have as much trauma, they haven't really reflected as much. It can be really hard. But what I find when you do it with people over and over again, they come up with different things, and they come up with important things that did change how they felt about themselves or their life. Like I mentioned about earlier when we were speaking about Dr. Dan Siegel, in the course, he remembers us a trauma that he hadn't thought of as a trauma until he was in a course where he had to come up with a trauma for the training he was doing. And then even as he tells it, another previous trauma that's related comes up, so it's just very powerful. And it helps you start to realize, okay, here maybe are some of the things I haven't resolved. Mm-hmm. And then you can start to write about them. And, we know a lot that writing about emotionally laden experiences is helpful. It helps psychologically, but it helps us physically too. The first studies that were done about it were by James Pennebaker, and he did these studies where he had students, college students, I think it was, write about something traumatic for 15 minutes a day for a week. And, those kids got less sick in the next 6 months. They didn't show up with student help. I mean, they didn't just, and often they wrote about things they had never told anybody. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But that were things they hadn't really resolved.
I think I'm a huge proponent of writing. I think that also it provides some level of safety, emotional safety, that if you're not ready to say things out loud, that here is a place that, maybe you might choose to share it with a therapist, but if not, it's a place for you and you only to process. It's another level of processing. Talking is a level of processing, but writing allows you to process some of those things and then choose from that what you're ready to maybe speak about or go into. But I love those tips. I definitely think that we have our book Lessons from the Toughest Kids, and one of the lessons in there is everybody needs to calm down. That's one of the things that we all need to do to control that back brain. And, we know with kids who have experienced trauma, often stuck in that back brain, that if we add our back brain to it, it's a chaotic mess. And so I totally agree that having those, what should be basic skills of being able to calm and regulate, is a great tip. And then, definitely, I think I love your resource, the Making Sense of Your Life. I personally plan to take a look at it and dive into it. And I think recommending to folks who might be considering it to, maybe it's something to do with your therapist. If you're somebody who has experienced some of those big traumas or extensive prolonged periods of trauma, to work through something like that with somebody that you trust to get that extra layer of support. But those are fantastic, first steps for helping somebody to understand their self and their inner voice. So I appreciate that.
Oh, you're welcome. And I think, writing helps to organize trauma and makes it so, you feel more in control and it's not taking you over. Mm. It's not visiting you whenever it feels like it's visiting you when you're deciding to write about it. And you can manage that and you can do something different with it. And I do think it really is helpful. But yes, so thank you. Yes, I the thing I like in the course too is we do a lot of videos. So we show people kind of what it looks like. And sometimes people watch, there's especially the one about, your attachment as a child over and over again. And then they go, oh, wait, that's neat, because I think we're not very good at identifying our own attachment pattern, but when we see it over and over again, we can go, oh, okay, I learned to take care of myself, or I learned, you've got to, cling on to people to get your needs met, or you start to go, oh, okay, wait a minute, and that I think is just really helpful for helping us have more control and be able to calm down,
It's
especially when we're
empowering.
triggered.
Yeah, it's very empowering for you to say, well, hang on, I know what's going on here, and I can be in control of it. As you said, very gives you a sense of control. So, well, Lisa, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. You just bring such a wealth of knowledge and experience, and I would love to hear more of your stories at some point in the future. But we really appreciate you being part of the podcast, and maybe we can invite you back for another one day.
That would be fun. I really enjoyed it, Kirsty.
Thank you.